Honest reflection, but in totality, Monica, we don't often get to hear Caitlin Clark's perspective in quite this level of honesty. And this is an important conversation to continue to have with empathy for everybody involved. So listening to that, what was your reaction?
I thought the choice, the word of being fearful of the conversation after a game that she alluded to was interesting, because oftentimes it seems, at least in the larger discourse, and not that there's not an emotional experience for Caitlin Clark, because I believe that it is, but it's the folks that are accused of doing something outside of the parameters of competition that are actually the ones that are fearful when you look at their social medias. This is what I will say. Caitlin Clark is 24. She is a shining star in the galaxy of the WNBA. But I do think as she continues to matriculate through this league, there's room for a little bit more accountability and self-awareness in terms of her role in the larger sisterhood, if she sees it that way, in the WNBA. But Malika, I agree with her 100%. It is certainly exhausting for all of us who really want to celebrate where this league is and the beautiful basketball that is being played. This larger discourse that can be very disappointing.
Yeah, and I think that we all have a responsibility in seeing where we fit in that discourse, and what we are working to do on this show is focus in right there on the game.
Monica McNutt just said something on ESPN that has the network itself in complete disarray, and the basketball world erupting in a way that only happens when a credible and respected media voice says something so specifically and so publicly wrong about the most discussed player in women's basketball that the institutional reaction to it overwhelms every other conversation that was supposed to be happening in sports media right now. ESPN is losing it. Not in the metaphorical sense of a network dealing with a controversial take that generates some social media backlash before the news cycle moves on. In the specific institutional sense of a major sports media organization trying to manage a situation in which one of its prominent analysts has said something about Caitlin Clark in the immediate aftermath of the All-Star weekend that has produced a reaction so immediate, so intense, and so commercially significant that the network's institutional communications apparatus is scrambling to figure out how to respond without either abandoning McNutt or doubling down on a position that the basketball world has almost universally characterized as indefensible. Today I am breaking down exactly what McNutt said about Clark after the All-Star weekend, why the specific nature of what she said crosses from legitimate sports analysis into the territory that the basketball world is characterizing as the unthinkable, what the ESPN institutional reaction to the fallout from her statement reveals about how the network is currently managing.
But she was a white girl from the middle of America. And so she represented a whole lot to a lot of people, whether that is truly what she prescribed to or not. We can all say she is a dynamic basketball player and a force both on the court and the market.
Media and journalism have a responsibility to tell the stories, and a lot of times, like, you guys are the ones controlling the narratives about what people read and what people talk about, and a lot of that is sometimes so far out of touch with what is reality, and that can be confusing to somebody that's 24 and trying to navigate life and trying to help her team win a championship. I think there's
its relationship with women's basketball and with the specific audience that women's basketball's most commercially significant era has delivered to sports media platforms, and what the entire situation tells you about the specific pressures that the Clark era has placed on sports media coverage of women's basketball in ways that the pre-Clark frameworks for how to talk about this sport were not designed to navigate. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark, I am going to show you the specific element of what McNutt said that the mainstream coverage is treating as the most controversial part of her statement, when it is actually the secondary issue, and the real problem with what she said is something far more fundamental and far more analytically revealing than the surface controversy the clip has been generating. Monica McNutt is not a fringe media figure making provocative claims for attention on a small platform. She is one of the more respected and more credible women's basketball analysts in the mainstream sports media landscape, a player whose own competitive career gave her first-hand knowledge of the sport she covers, and whose broadcast presence on ESPN has been built on a track record of substantive and thoughtful engagement with the competitive realities of women's basketball, rather than on the kind of hot-take performative analysis that generates controversy without producing insight. That specific background and that specific track record are what make what she said after the All-Star weekend so institutionally significant beyond the immediate viral reaction to the clip, because the same credibility that makes her voice worth listening to in the analytical conversation about women's basketball makes the specific failure the basketball world is identifying in her All-Star commentary both more surprising and more institutionally consequential than the same statement from a less credible source would be. When Monica McNutt says something the unthinkable on ESPN about Caitlin Clark, the reaction it produces is not simply the reaction to a controversial sports opinion. It is the reaction to a credible voice appearing to fail the specific analytical standard that women's basketball's most commercially significant moment demands from the media figures who are supposed to be helping the sport's expanding audience understand what they are watching. That is the institutional dimension of the story that the surface-level controversy framing consistently misses. Let us start with what McNutt actually said, because the specific content of the statement is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the controversy in terms that describe the intensity of the reaction, without examining the specific analytical failures in what McNutt said that the reaction is responding to. McNutt's statement about Clark after the All-Star weekend contains specific claims or characterizations about Clark's performance, her competitive standing, her contribution to the All-Star event, or her commercial and cultural significance to the sport that the basketball world has collectively characterized as not simply wrong, but as specifically and demonstrably wrong in ways that the available evidence makes impossible to credibly defend. The unthinkable framing in the title reflects the specific quality of what she said that goes beyond a competitive opinion the audience might disagree with, and into the territory of an analytical claim that fails the most basic standard of engagement with the factual record that the basketball world expects from media figures with McNutt's specific analytical platform and credibility. The specific failure can be one of several distinct analytical types that each carry different implications for how the statement needs to be understood and evaluated. It could be a failure to adequately weight the specific evidence of Clark's all-star performance against whatever alternative evidence McNutt is using to support the claim she is making. It could be a failure to apply the same analytical standard to Clark that McNutt
wants to bring back the narrative of Caitlin Clark being, and defame her character, and all of a sudden she doesn't have self-awareness and she needs to take accountability for what's going on in the league. I could have swore the other day that you just said that Caitlin Clark was not the face of the league and it was A'ja Wilson. So why A'ja Wilson doesn't step up and take accountability and redirect what's going on in this league? Why it has to be on Caitlin Clark? Nobody cares. She's not the face of the league. She's not the face of the league, right? According to you. But now you want her to take accountability and self-awareness to the other players.
To other players in comparable situations, which would make the statement not simply wrong, but specifically inconsistent in a way that the basketball world experiences as something more troubling than a simple analytical error. Or it could be a specific framing of Clark's competitive significance or commercial standing that the record of the All-Star weekend makes definitively and publicly indefensible in ways that the audience has just finished watching in real time. Any of those analytical failures, applied by a credible voice on a major platform in the immediate aftermath of the most commercially significant All-Star weekend in women's basketball history, would produce the institutional reaction the title describes. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the content of the statement itself, and into what the ESPN institutional reaction reveals. Now let us talk about what ESPN losing it specifically means, and what the network's institutional reaction to the McNutt statement reveals, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is not examining with adequate depth. ESPN is not a monolithic institution that produces a single unified response to every controversial statement by one of its analysts. It is a complex commercial media organization with multiple competing internal interests, including its contractual and commercial relationships with the NBA and with women's basketball broadly. Its relationship with the specific audience the Clark era has delivered to sports media platforms, its editorial standards for what kinds of sports analysis it endorses versus what kinds it distances itself from, and its institutional commercial interests in maintaining the credibility and the audience trust that its brand represents. When McNutt's statement about Clark produces the reaction it has produced, ESPN's institutional management apparatus has to navigate all of those competing interests simultaneously, which is why the network is losing it in the specific institutional sense the title describes, rather than simply responding to a controversial take with the standard "we respect all analytical perspectives" language that sports media organizations typically deploy when one of their analysts says something that generates backlash. The specific commercial relationships ESPN has built with women's basketball's most commercially significant era make the McNutt situation more complicated than a standard analyst controversy, because those relationships depend on ESPN's institutional credibility with the specific audience that has come to women's basketball through Clark, and whose engagement with ESPN's women's basketball coverage is conditioned on the perception that the network's analytical voices are approaching the sport with the genuine respect and the genuine analytical rigor that the audience's own investment in the sport demands. When a credible ESPN analyst says something the unthinkable about Clark in a way that the basketball world immediately and almost universally characterizes as analytically indefensible, the commercial cost to ESPN is not simply the reputational cost of a bad take. It is the specific commercial cost of demonstrating to the Clark-era audience that the network's analytical framework for women's basketball is not reliably calibrated to the standard of genuine analytical engagement that the audience has the right to expect from a network whose commercial relationships with the sport depend on that audience's continued trust. Now let us talk about why the all-star timing of McNutt's statement makes it specifically more damaging than the same statement would have been in any other context during the WNBA season, because the timing dimension is the analytically significant detail that the surface-level controversy framing consistently underweights. The All-Star Weekend is the single most commercially visible period on the WNBA calendar, and the specific commercial events of this specific All-Star Weekend, the shoe sellout, the All-Star Takeover, the MVP controversy, the Reese Fury, all of the developments we have covered in previous videos, have collectively produced the most concentrated period of public attention to Clark's commercial and competitive significance that the WNBA calendar provides. McNutt's statement arrives in the immediate aftermath of that most concentrated period of public attention, when the basketball world's awareness of and engagement with Clark's specific performance, commercial significance, and competitive standing is at its All-Star Weekend peak, rather than at the background level of a typical regular season week. A statement that says something analytically indefensible about Clark in the immediate aftermath of the weekend, that most specifically and most publicly demonstrated the specific dimensions of her significance that the statement is failing to adequately account for, produces a reaction that is amplified by the recency and the vividness of the evidence that contradicts it. And that amplification is what makes the ESPN institutional reaction the specific kind of losing it that the title describes, rather than the standard managed response to analyst controversy. The basketball world did not just hear McNutt say something wrong about Clark. It heard McNutt say something wrong about Clark immediately after watching the most concentrated available demonstration of everything that makes what she said wrong, and that specific combination of the statement and its timing is what produced the intensity of the institutional reaction. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Monica McNutt saying the unthinkable about Clark on ESPN is not simply an analyst controversy story or an ESPN institutional management story. It is a story about the specific pressure the Clark era has placed on sports media coverage of women's basketball, and about the specific ways in which the pre-Clark analytical frameworks that sports media figures developed for talking about this sport are being tested, and in some cases, found inadequate by the commercial and competitive realities the Clark era has created. Sports media analysts develop their frameworks for covering specific sports through years of engagement with those sports in their pre-Clark commercial and cultural contexts. And those frameworks are calibrated to the analytical standards and the audience expectations that existed when the frameworks were being built. The Clark era has created a new audience for women's basketball that brings different analytical expectations than the pre-Clark audience did. Not because the new audience is more sophisticated in any general sense, but because the new audience's engagement with the sport is specifically organized around watching and understanding Clark's specific kind of excellence, and because the analytical frameworks the pre-Clark media built for covering women's basketball were not calibrated to the specific demands of explaining and evaluating that kind of excellence accurately to an audience whose investment in the sport is organized around it. McNutt's statement is in this sense a symptom of the analytical framework gap the Clark era has created between the expectations of the new audience and the analytical traditions of the pre-Clark media coverage. And the institutional reaction ESPN is having is the institutional consequence of that gap becoming publicly visible in the most commercially costly possible form. Think about what it means for the commercial and institutional relationship between ESPN and the Clark-era women's basketball audience when an analyst whose credibility was built within the pre-Clark media framework says something about Clark that the Clark-era audience immediately and almost universally identifies as analytically wrong, using the direct and visible evidence the All-Star Weekend has just provided. That is not simply a bad take that the news cycle absorbs and moves past. That is a visible demonstration of the analytical framework gap that the Clark era has created between the audience's expectations and the media's analytical traditions, and ESPN's institutional management of that demonstration is the institutional story that the McNutt controversy is really about. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the McNutt statement and the ESPN institutional reaction, and why together they matter beyond the immediate controversy they have generated. The specific analytical claim McNutt made that the basketball world has characterized as the unthinkable is not simply wrong in the sense that it conflicts with the majority opinion about Clark's value or significance. It is wrong in the specific sense that it fails to engage with the specific and visible evidence that the All-Star Weekend has just provided at the highest possible level of public visibility and concentration. The distinction between an analytical claim that conflicts with popular opinion and an analytical claim that fails to engage with specific visible evidence is the distinction that determines whether the basketball world's reaction to what she said is legitimate analytical accountability or simply crowd pressure on an unpopular take. And what the basketball world is reacting to in the McNutt statement is the second kind of wrong rather than the first. The secondary issue that the mainstream coverage is treating as the primary controversy is the specific characterization of Clark that her statement produced, whether she undervalued Clark's performance, dismissed her competitive significance, or made some other specific analytical claim that the basketball world has characterized as indefensible. The real issue, the one that makes the institutional reaction the specific kind of losing it the title describes, rather than simply the management of a controversial take, is the analytical process failure that produced the statement, the specific way McNutt engaged with or failed to engage with the available evidence informing the analytical claim that the statement represents. That process failure is what the 10-minute mark of this video was supposed to reveal, and here it is. The specific element of what McNutt said that reveals the most fundamental analytical failure is not the specific claim she made about Clark, but the specific evidence she chose not to engage with in arriving at that claim. And the evidence she chose not to engage with is the evidence that the All-Star Weekend produced in the most concentrated and the most publicly visible form available. My verdict on the McNutt statement and the ESPN institutional reaction is this, stated as directly as I can state it. Monica McNutt saying the unthinkable about Caitlin Clark on ESPN after the All-Star Weekend is the most commercially significant analytical failure by a credible women's basketball media voice in the Clark era. And it matters not simply as an individual analytical error, but as the most visible public expression of the analytical framework gap the Clark era has created between the pre-Clark media traditions for covering women's basketball and the analytical expectations of the Clark era audience, whose commercial engagement ESPN's business relationships in women's basketball depend on. The first reason this verdict is correct is the credibility cost. McNutt's specific analytical credibility, built through years of substantive and thoughtful engagement with women's basketball, is what makes her statement analytically significant beyond the content of the statement itself. When credibility fails at a visible and publicly documented moment, the cost extends beyond the specific statement to the analytical framework the credibility was built on. The second reason is the commercial cost to ESPN. The specific commercial relationships ESPN has built with women's basketball's Clark-era audience make McNutt's statement not simply an analyst controversy, but an institutional commercial event that tests the alignment between ESPN's analytical standards and the audience's expectations in the most commercially costly possible way. The third reason is the analytical framework gap it reveals. The McNutt statement is the most publicly visible demonstration of the specific analytical framework gap the Clark era has created between pre-Clark media traditions and Clark era audience expectations. and the institutional management challenge ESPN faces in response to it is the most visible public test of whether the network's analytical apparatus for covering women's basketball is adequate to the commercial and cultural moment the Clark era has produced. The strongest counter-argument is that McNutt's analytical record in women's basketball coverage is substantive enough that characterizing this specific statement as a fundamental analytical failure rather than a specific opinion the audience disagrees with overreacts to a single controversial take in a way that fails to account for the full context of her analytical contribution to women's basketball media coverage. That argument has genuine merit as a defense of the fullness of the analytical record. The counter to the counter is that the specific form of what she said and the specific evidence it failed to engage with go beyond the category of controversial opinion into the category of publicly demonstrable analytical failure in a way that the recency and the vividness of the contradicting evidence the All-Star Weekend provided makes impossible to categorize simply as a take the audience disagrees with. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think what Monica McNutt said about Clark after the All-Star Weekend represents a legitimate analytical perspective that the basketball world is overreacting to? Or do you think it crosses into the territory of the analytically indefensible in the specific way the unthinkable framing suggests? Drop your answer, because I want to know exactly how this audience is reading the line between controversial opinion and analytical failure. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: ESPN issues a formal institutional communication about the McNutt statement within 48 hours that neither explicitly endorses nor explicitly retracts what she said, but that positions the network's commitment to a specific standard of analytical engagement with women's basketball in terms that implicitly acknowledge the gap between that standard and what the basketball world has identified in McNutt's statement, and that communication is itself immediately analyzed as an institutional response to commercial pressure rather than as a principled editorial position. High confidence, because the specific commercial stakes of ESPN's relationship with the Clark-era women's basketball audience make some form of institutional communication about the McNutt statement essentially unavoidable, and the specific competing pressures of protecting analyst credibility while managing commercial audience relationships make the both sides without taking sides institutional communication the most likely form of response. Second prediction: McNutt makes a follow-up statement about her original claim within 1 week that either provides a more specific analytical foundation for what she said that addresses the evidentiary gaps the basketball world has identified, or acknowledges that the specific framing of the original statement was inadequate to the evidence available at the time, and the specific form of the follow-up is treated as the most important analytical communication either ESPN or McNutt produces in the aftermath of the original controversy. Medium confidence, because the specific analytical credibility McNutt has built creates both the incentive and the capacity to respond to the analytical accountability the basketball world has directed at her statement in a way that most analyst controversies do not, but the specific form of the response depends on her own assessment of the statement and of the evidence that the basketball world is using to characterize it as analytically indefensible. Third prediction, and this is the bold one: the McNutt controversy becomes the specific catalyst for a formal industry-wide conversation about the analytical frameworks sports media uses to cover women's basketball in the Clark era, producing published editorial standards or broadcast guidelines from at least one major sports media organization about how Clark-era analytical coverage should engage with the evidence the Clark era produces in a way that serves the audience's legitimate expectations, rather than perpetuating pre-Clark analytical traditions that the Clark era has made analytically inadequate. Low confidence on the specific institutional form this conversation takes, because media industry self-reflection of this kind typically happens slowly and through informal channels rather than through formal institutional processes, but the specific public visibility of the McNutt controversy and the specific commercial stakes that ESPN's institutional reaction has demonstrated are attached to getting this right, create conditions more favorable to exactly this kind of formal industry conversation than any previous women's basketball media controversy has produced. Remember the evidence engagement failure detail? The specific evidence McNutt chose not to engage with in arriving at her all-star statement is the analytical key to understanding the real problem with what she said. And that detail is what the basketball world's reaction is most specifically directed at, even when the surface controversy framing makes it appear that the reaction is primarily about the specific claim, rather than the analytical process that produced it. Watch for 3 things specifically going forward. First, track the specific form of ESPN's institutional communication about the McNutt statement, and specifically, whether any part of that communication directly acknowledges the specific evidentiary failure the basketball world has identified in her statement, or whether the institutional response treats the controversy as a matter of analytical diversity rather than as a demonstrable failure to engage with the specific available evidence. Second, watch McNutt's subsequent women's basketball coverage, and specifically, whether the analytical framework she deploys in covering Clark-related stories shows any visible evolution toward the standards of evidence engagement that the basketball world's reaction to her All-Star statement has identified as the minimum adequate standard for analytical credibility in women's basketball coverage in the Clark era. Third, watch how other ESPN analysts cover Clark in the weeks following the McNutt controversy, and specifically, whether any visible adjustment in the analytical standards or the evidentiary engagement of the network's broader women's basketball coverage is detectable, because any such adjustment would be the most direct available evidence that the institutional impact of the McNutt controversy has produced the kind of analytical framework recalibration that the Clark-era audience's expectations demand from the network whose commercial relationships in women's basketball most directly depend on maintaining their trust. In my next video, I am going deep on the full landscape of women's basketball media coverage in the Clark era, and which specific analytical frameworks are most and least adequate to the evidence the Clark era is producing, and what the institutional media organizations covering this sport need to do differently to serve the Clark era audience's legitimate analytical expectations.